Co-founder of the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro, has come out with his worst take yet, and I, from Midwest America, have something to say about it. Let's get into it.
Young person and you can't afford to live here, then maybe you should not live here. I mean, that is a real thing. Yeah, I know that we've now grown up in a society that says that you deserve to live where you grew up, but the reality is that the history of America is almost literally the opposite of that. The history of America is you go to a place where there is opportunity. And if the opportunities are limited here and they're not changing, then you really should try to think about other places where you have better opportunities.
For those new to the channel, my name is Casey. I am a therapist, a father, and a husband for more than a decade, and I live in the Midwest where everything is much more affordable because we don't live on the coasts, but yet it is still true that many people who would like to own a home or who would like to remain in their hometown are being priced out. If you can support this Midwestern midwit in the fight for conservative values and paleo conservative values, let's like, share, and subscribe and get into Ben Shapiro, possibly his worst take of all time. I think Ben Shapiro was pretty severely impacted by the October 7th attacks, which happened a couple years ago, and he has put forward on his channel on the Daily Wire much more about Israel than he has about American policy, and he's suffered a great deal of condemnation for that among conservatives because he was such a powerful voice. He was originally part of the intellectual dark web, which was a group of podcasters that Barry Weiss sort of put together as being the voices for sort of neoliberalism about 10 years ago. That included people like Jordan B. Peterson, the Weinstein brothers, Joe Rogan, and the odd one out was Ben Shapiro because he was the only one who probably had ever voted Republican that was part of that intellectual dark web. And so he was a very young man, a Harvard graduate and a law school graduate, presumably passed the bar at the time where he started sort of his touring and campus speaking and then eventually having a podcast and co-founding the Daily Wire. So he came into prominence because in some ways he did have some clout with liberal, classical liberals like Barry Weiss, formerly wrote for the New York Times. He ran in those circles. He ran in the classical liberal circles. And I think that, quite frankly, in his recent combativeness with Tucker Carlson and trying to keep people like Nick Fuentes out of the conservative movement, he has demonstrated that he maintains those classical liberal values, which is perfectly fine. I don't assume that he's ever voted Democrat, but he does sort of hold to the old guard and, really kind of represents a boomer value set where he's protecting the bag or protecting the clout and the access to the market that was had over the last 30 years and doesn't necessarily represent the new right, even in as much as someone like J.D. Vance would. So after the background, all that said, the price of eggs are still exceedingly high. That's why I moved my family to the country. That's why we started having chickens and crops and trying to raise our own food. The price of housing is still pricing out many of those Gen Z folks who are now turning to victim mentality, even on the right. Even as they vote Republican, vote for Trump, they're turning towards people like Nick Fuentes in order to find meaning and purpose, or at least, somebody who seems to speak their language. And Ben Shapiro this comment on the Trigonometry podcast is so flamingly out of touch. And I give Ben a lot of credit for coming into the wealth that I assume that he has. I think he's worth multiple millions of dollars. If he liquidated his assets, it would probably be quite a lot. Good for him. I'm sure that in many ways he's earned it. However, that is so out of touch with the plight of the common person who resides in flyover country, who does not have opportunity. I work with people coming out of addiction. I work with people coming out of mental health crises. There are not opportunities for us here at the bottom, Ben. And it's so out of touch for you to just say, well, just move. Your family, your dad and your mom live there. If you want to move out of the house, you can't do it in your hometown. That is not a conservative value. That's not the message that will capture and withhold young men into the conservative movement. And it is so out of touch that Ben Shapiro will lose his access to the market, and he's losing followers, losing listeners over and over and over, week by week, that he continues to go on places like Trigonometry to try to defend his corner of the market. That doesn't mean that Ben Shapiro hasn't done and said some good things, and I am exceedingly grateful for the Daily Wire and the fight that they were able to put forward during the 2020 Summer of Love. But frankly, at this point, I think that there are other voices at the Daily Wire which have much more value and much more are people that you should continue to listen to, like Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, and possibly even Matt Fradd, who's coming into the Daily Wire soon. So even though Ben Shapiro does not represent me because he's wealthy and he has no idea what the economics are like down here on the ground, there are still some people that are grounded, I think, in a little bit more of the circles. The trad Catholics that they have at the Daily Wire are grounded in circles that are much closer to the average American man and a man raising the average American children, not ones that are preemptively going to Harvard and these Ivy League schools, but are just normie people that are trying to get by. Like Matt Walsh, he wears flannels. I'm sure he has a lot of money, but he comes across as someone who can be more attuned to the normal man. And Ben Shapiro he might just not be one of us, but he's certainly welcome in the conservative movement. He just does not any longer, and maybe he never did, share the mainstream view of what it means to be conservative, because one of those values is I can stay in my hometown, invest there, be able to live there and reside there affordably, and be able to invest in my family and meaning and purpose that I've had where I grew up. If you can support just a creator and a therapist here in Flyover Country who's a father of 4, please like, share, and subscribe. We don't need to push Ben Shapiro out, but we do need to push and press in the right ideas for the people down here, us normies. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'll talk to you later.